that I know that you dislike this intensely. You have created a nation which I love and lived here for 5 years, which is based on a constitution which is totally dysfunctional, for this point in time. And of course, most of you actually believe that the constitution is right. It is not, in my mind. I am aware of that, and I am aware of that I am treading on what you call it, shells or egg shells or whatever when I talk about this. But I am very critical about the short-termness of capitalism, which is of course only a consequence of the short-termness of politicians, which is in a term is the consequence of the short-termness of ordinary people. And I think the only solution that exists at this point in time is the benign, perhaps not dictatorship, but at least very much stronger government, much higher taxes, much more state control of investment flows, much more state redistribution of the proceeds from the process. This is what Dennis, in his polite language, calls social solutions, rather than as opposed to technical solutions. But here they are. This is what I think one ought to be doing after having worked on this thing for 40 years. I have a practical proposal because I think it's, from my life in many places, it's much more interesting with concrete proposals than there are with generalizations, and then I'm done, and we are actually on time. That's fine. The biggest problem at the time, I don't think is oil, I think is climate. So we need, if we wanted to choose our area for experimentation with new forms of governance, we should probably look at climate. And interestingly, if you start thinking about it, humanity has, on this score, a delegated authority to a supranational body, namely the UN IPCC, the UN, what's that called? So many Cs. The UN, so the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, who have been given the authority to state what is right or wrong on climate issues. They state the scientific position. So we could authorize the IPCC to do this. So that would be IPCC 2. But then, of course, we could move one step further. The civilized world, that excludes the United States of America, is in the process of trying to introduce an airline tax, so that there is one way in which you could get money into the global climate fighting system. And so, of course, you could give this money to, instead of, as is the current plan, that it goes to the national governments, you could put that money to IPCC, and then you could say to IPCC that not only is it your job to present the scientific agreement on what is right and wrong in the climate area, not only is it your job to advise national governments on what should be national climate policy, but here is the money, please do so, or they would then basically execute and do those things. This kind of shift of power in a limited area might be, a kind of way, a more edible way of introducing semi-authoritarian government, over the heads of democracy. And you must always remember when your gut reaction is that this can't happen and it shouldn't happen and Jorgen is crazy. We have done this to the central banks. We do have central banks that we have increasingly tried to disconnect from the political fray, so that there are so-called benign dictators that actually run the central banks. So there is a role model here. And so in my book, I think, although I would have scrapped democracy and capitalism if I could, I can't, and this might be a halfway station. So that ends my talk, which is largely about decision delays. So what is my conclusion after having promoted limits to growth issues for 40 years? Well, it is basically, number one, that if left to their own, democracy and capitalism will not act in time.